Hello everyone, today we're going to be reading Well Really, Mr. Twiddle. I'm certainly in luck today, wife, said Mr. Twiddle, looking very pleased with himself. First, I found that nice pencil I lost last week, and then when I went to feed the hens, there were 5 eggs, and now the postman has brought me a present from my sister Hannah, a nice new hat. He tried it on. It was certainly a nice hat. Mrs. Twiddle wanted to put a little brown hen feather in the band, but Mr. Twiddle won't let her. No, I don't like feathers in hats, he said. If I only had a nice new suit now to go with my hat, I should look smart. Well, as you're having such a lucky day today, you might find one lying in the road, said Mrs. Twiddle with a giggle. You simply never know what might happen when your luck is in, said Mrs. Twiddle. I wouldn't be surprised if I found a £5 note when I was walking this morning, said Mr. Twiddle. Well, you'd have to take it into the police station and hand it in to the police, said Mrs. Twiddle. Ah, but my luck is they won't find the owner and they would give it back to me, said Mr. Twiddle, still admiring himself in his new hat. You've got it on back to front, but I suppose you don't really mind that, said Mrs. Twiddle, with another little giggle. A timid knock came at the door, and the little girl's head peeped in. Please, Mrs. Twiddle, may I borrow your cat to play with this morning? Certainly, dear, said Mrs. Twiddle. Call her. She does love playing with kids, and a kind little girl like you. Mr. Twiddle watched the little girl carry the purring cat away, and he looked very pleased. Well, isn't that another bit of luck? He said. Well, we've gotten rid of this cat for a whole morning. Now I can walk around the house without falling over it. I don't know why you don't like our dear old cat, said Mrs. Twiddle. You're the only person who ever falls over her anyway. And do you know why? Said Mr. Twiddle, suddenly looking rather fierce. I'll tell you, it's because I'm the only person that cat tries to trip up. She's always walking through my legs. Bit of good luck, I tell you, puss going off with Polly. Well, if you don't go and get the fish for dinner, your good luck will come to an end, because you'll go hungry, said Mrs. Twiddle, looking at the clock. Put on your old hat, Twiddle. Get the shopping basket, do. Take some paper with you for the fish. Twiddle fetched the basket. He put a newspaper in it to wrap the fish in when he bought it. But he didn't change his nice new hat for his old one. No, he thought he looked so nice in his new one that he felt he might be able to give everyone a treat when they looked at him. Put your old hat on, called Mrs. Twiddle when she saw him going out with his new one on his head. No, dear, said Mr. Twiddle, trying to find a quick reason for keeping it on. I told you my luck is in today. I suppose I find a new suit somewhere. I'd look dreadful if I didn't have a nice hat to wear with it. Don't be silly, Twiddle, called his wife, but by that time he was out of the front gate and couldn't hear her. He hurried along to the fish shop. He stood there in the queue for 10 minutes and then got a large piece of rather smelly cod. He had it wrapped carefully in the newspaper and hoped that he wouldn't be followed home by half a dozen cats. I won't go home through the village in case the cats smell the fish and come after me, thought Twiddle, remembering how annoyed he had been last time by having 5 cats trailing after him all the way home, sniffing the kippers in his basket. I'll go back through the wood. So he took the other way home and wandered along in the wood, enjoying the smell of the hawthorn blossom and the sight of the bluebells. It was a very hot day, and Mr. Twiddle was glad he hadn't had an overcoat on. Then he saw a most extraordinary sight. He stopped and looked as if he couldn't believe his eyes. Neatly folded up under a bush was a suit of beautiful new clothes. Twiddle stood up and stared, and his heart began to thump in excitement. There! What he had said that very morning! His luck was certainly in, because here was a nice suit of clothes waiting to go with his nice new hat. But wait, Twiddle, said Twiddle to himself cautiously. They might belong to someone, you know. Have a look around and see. So he had a good look around, but he could see nobody at all. He went back to the neat pile of clothes and looked at them. Coat, trousers, waistcoat, vest, socks, braces. Why, there was everything except a hat. This is most extraordinary, said Twiddle. It just shows what can happen when your luck is in. I got that new hat from Hannah, and lo and behold, I find a complete set of clothes to go with it, and nobody to own them. He looked at them again. They were exactly his size. They were meant for him. He looked at the collar of the suit, half expecting his own name marked there, but he was quite disappointed when there wasn't. But, would you believe it, on the neat white handkerchief folded inside the left-hand pocket of the coat was the letter T in pale blue thread. Twiddle stared at it in the greatest delight. "That proves it," he said. "Absolutely, completely, no doubt whatever. This is certainly my lucky morning. Goodness knows what I shall find next." He picked up the clothes and was about to put them into his basket when he remembered about the fish. "Better undo the fish, take a bit of paper and wrap up the clothes, although smell of fish," said Twiddle, forgetting that the paper must smell very strongly of fish already. He wrapped up the clothes carefully in some of his newspaper and then made his way home, wondering what bit of good luck would happen to him next. "I shall put on this new suit as soon as I get home," thought Mr. Twiddle, "and wear it with my new hat. How grand I shall look!" He was longing to tell his wife about his new piece of luck, and he was disappointed when he got home and found that she was out. He went to get himself some lemonade to drink, and then he heard Mrs. Twiddle at the front door. She was talking to somebody. "Bother! She brought a visitor home," thought Mr. Twiddle, who didn't like his wife's visitors very much because they talked an awful lot. Then he got a terrible shock. Mrs. Twiddle brought her visitor into the kitchen, and Twiddle could hardly believe his eyes when a poor, shivering, dripping man in a wet bathing suit. He gasped at him in surprise. "Twiddle, I met this poor fellow running down the street in such an awful state," said Mrs. Twiddle. "Twiddle, I met this poor fellow running down the street in an awful state," said Mrs. Twiddle. "He thought he would bathe in the blue pool because it was so hot today, so he took his bathing suit and went into the wood. He took off his nice new clothes, hid them under a bush, and went to bathe. And when they came back, they had been taken by a robber," said the shivering man, standing as close to the kitchen fire as he could. "So, Twiddle, I brought this poor fellow here and thought you could lend him a suit," said Mrs. Twiddle, "and I thought I'd give him a hot meal or he'd get a terrible cold, and then perhaps you'll go along to the police station with him and tell the police about the robbery. I mean, a man who is hateful enough to take a bather's clothes deserves to go to prison at once." Twiddle's heart went right down into his boots and stayed there. He stared at his wife in such a peculiar way that she thought he must be ill. He couldn't say a single word, but he thought a lot. Oh dear! So they were his clothes, and he was bathing. Why didn't I think of the blue pool? Oh dear, oh dear! I hope Mrs. Twiddle doesn't look in the basket yet and find the clothes. What am I to do? "Twiddle, don't stand gasping there like a moonstruck goldfish," said Mrs. Twiddle sharply. "Go and get a suit of old clothes, quickly. Do you want this poor fellow to die of cold?" Mr. Twiddle wasn't sure if he did or not. He felt in such a terrible muddle. He went upstairs to think it over, but then he came down again very quickly when he remembered he had left the basket in the scullery with the fish and the suit there. He must certainly hide that basket. He snatched up the basket, opened the scullery window, and dropped the basket and its contents neatly outside under a lilac bush. There, they would be safe there until he could think what was best to do. "Twiddle, what in the world are you doing in the scullery?" called his wife. "You don't keep your clothes there. They're in a cupboard upstairs." Twiddle shot upstairs. He sank down on his bed. What could he do? What could he say? Nobody would believe him if he said he had thought that finding these clothes would be a bit of good luck he had that day. He could see himself now that it had been a very silly thing to think, but he had really thought it. "If I go down there and give him his right clothes, he might as well haul me off to the police station and put me into prison," thought poor Mr. Twiddle. "And if I don't give him them, I shall feel really awful. He's got to have them back somehow." Mrs. Twiddle shouted upstairs, "Twiddle! Will you bring some clothes down at once for this poor shivering fellow? I'm just about to cook dinner quickly so that he can have something hot. Where's the fish?" Now Twiddle was in another muddle. The fish was in the basket underneath the lilac bush outside the scullery window. But he couldn't say that, of course. He seemed to be getting deeper and deeper into trouble. He scrabbled hastily into the cupboard and took down an armful of clothes. Mrs. Twiddle gave them to the wet, shivering bather and shut him into the drawing room to change. Where's the fish? She said to Twiddle sharply. Now, let me see, said Twiddle, looking very vague. Now, just let me see. A meow suddenly came from the scullery next to the kitchen. There's Puss back again, said Mrs. Twiddle, and she looked really pleased. Open the kitchen door and let her in, Twiddle. She's a real home cat, never stays away for long. Twiddle opened the door, feeling that his good luck had completely vanished. The cat appeared, dragging behind it a pair of fishy-smelling trousers. Twiddle stared at the cat with great dislike. He knew at once what had happened. That tiresome animal had come home, smelled the fish in the basket lying under the clothes, and had scrabbled around in the paper and brought in the trousers because they now smelled so deliciously of fish. Well, look at that, said Mrs. Twiddle in the greatest astonishment. Whatever will the cat bring in next? A pair of trousers. Where did she get them from? The cat disappeared and came back again dragging a coat, which also smelt very strongly of fish. Mrs. Twiddle began to think she must be in some kind of very peculiar dream, made up of shivering bathers, fishy clothes, and a cat that came in and out with them. Then the drawing room flew wide open, and out came the bather, looking very different in Twiddle's old suit, which fitted him perfectly. He stood still and stared when he saw his coat and trousers over Mrs. Twiddle's arm, and then stared even more when the cat reappeared, dragging in a pair of fishy-looking socks. I say, look, there's my clothes the cat is bringing in. Your clothes? Stammered Mrs. Twiddle, thinking that her dream was turning into a nightmare. But how could Puss find them? Oh, goodness me, now she's bringing in a vest. The man picked up all his clothes. Mr. Twiddle forced himself to speak in an ordinary kind of voice, even though he was trembling inside. Well, if they're your clothes, perhaps you'd like to go back into the drawing room again, take off my shoes and put your own on. No, said the man decidedly, sniffing at his clothes. They smell of fish. I possibly couldn't wear them until the smell is gone. If you don't mind, I'll wear yours till tomorrow, then put my own on. I'll return yours then. I'll go now, but I wish I knew where your cat got my clothes from. He went out the front door and banged it shut. Mrs. Twiddle stared at Mr. Twiddle, feeling rather faint. She sat down in her rocking chair. Oh, Twiddle, I don't understand this all. I feel quite queer. How did Puss get those clothes? Do you think she was clever enough to understand all we said and went to hunt for them and found them? No, I don't, said Twiddle. It was just a bit of that cat's usual interference. Mrs. Twiddle alarmed him suddenly by leaping to her feet with a yell. Look, said Mrs. Twiddle, the cat's got the fish. Is that the fish you brought home for dinner, Twiddle? Oh, she's stolen it. She's over the wall by now. Twiddle, where did you put the fish, you silly, stupid fellow? It was in the basket under the lilac bush, said poor Twiddle. Mrs. Twiddle looked at him as if he was quite mad. Under the lilac bush? But why? Have you gone mad, Twiddle? You'd better go to bed, I think. You must be really ill. Twiddle thought the bed would be a very nice, peaceful place, and he went up thankfully. There was no dinner because the cat had taken the fish. But Mr. Twiddle didn't mind that. It was very nice to be able to pretend to sleep and not be asked any more awkward questions. What a good thing the cat had found the clothes and brought them in after all. Now nobody would ever know the silly thing he had done by taking them home with himself. But Twiddle was going to get a shock, because the bather isn't going to come back with Twiddle's old suit. He's quite a dishonest fellow, and he's going to keep it. But how can Twiddle go to the police and complain about that? Didn't he do the exactly same thing himself when he thought his luck was in? Poor old Twiddle, he's not so lucky after all. Thank you very much for listening. Until next time, it's me, Mira. Bye-bye.